Hello, class. Let's review American history from 1800 to the 1840s, culminating with the presidency of Andrew Jackson and a changing America. It's important to remember that Jefferson will mark the beginning of this shift when he becomes president in 1800. By purchasing Louisiana, he more than doubles the size of the country, but also violates the Constitution in doing so. So now we have another president who reads the Constitution loosely instead of strictly. The whole reason for the Democratic-Republican Party, in a sense, ceases to exist, and all politicians follow in Jefferson's footsteps by reading the Constitution loosely. This becomes known as the era of good feelings in American politics, when everybody is a Democratic-Republican, but with Federalist views. Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark out west to explore the Louisiana Territory. They make it all the way to the Pacific, finally once and for all opening up the United States from one ocean to the other. It's important to note that on their return, they pass others who are moving west, literally opening up the frontier to American settlement. At the end of Jefferson's second term, controversy arises. American ships are impressed by French and British ships around the world, and American sailors are taken hostage and forced to work on foreign vessels. In response, Jefferson signs the Embargo Act, which basically prevents American ships from entering British and French ports. This becomes very controversial, however, when American merchants are affected, unable to sell their products in these foreign ports. The following presidents, James Madison and James Monroe, will inherit this controversy. And in fact, as a result of the Embargo Act and the impressment of American sailors around the world, the War of 1812 begins and puts America on the world stage. The war itself is a relatively failed effort on both sides. The British actually invade America both from Canada and from the eastern seaboard, at one point actually burning Washington, D.C. The famous flag that flies above Baltimore Harbor becomes the source of the Star-Spangled Banner at this point. But the war does do one important thing, which is to make Andrew Jackson a household name. So the War of 1812 begins this idea of American power. The war ends with a peace treaty between the two sides, with very little gained on either side. However, Jackson has become a war hero. As the country continues to grow, sectionalism becomes an issue as different regions of the country combine for their common interests. Political disputes ensue between slave and non-slave states, requiring compromises as new states are added to the Union. In 1820, we have Missouri enter as a slave state, while Maine enters as a free state to maintain the balance between free and slave states. As the country grows, a transportation and economic revolution will transform the country and further fuel these sectional disputes. In 1830, the rate of travel from New York City to southern states like Georgia would be cut in half because of canals and steamboats. In addition to this, national roads are built from major cities. Factories arise around the country, including the ones at the Lowell Mills, which give women an opportunity to enter the workforce full-time. This will help fuel women's rights and the women's movement as women become more independent and economically secure. All of this gives rise to the presidency of Andrew Jackson. In the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson runs for president against three other competitors: Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. We see here candidates from the different sections of the country representing sectionalism, but we also end this election with what becomes known as the corrupt bargain. Jackson wins the electoral vote and the popular vote, but because he does not have a majority of electoral votes, as required by the Constitution, the election goes to the U.S. House of Representatives. In the U.S. House, Henry Clay from Kentucky was the Speaker, and although he was a candidate for president, was not one of the top two finishers, meaning he was ineligible for the presidency. The House votes for John Quincy Adams. Even though Jackson had the most popular and electoral votes, he is denied the presidency. John Quincy Adams becomes President of the United States and names Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Jackson uses this for the next 4 years, campaigning around the country, arguing that there was a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay, and more importantly, that democracy had been denied. As a result of this, in 1828, Jackson wins the presidency and becomes known as King Mob, creating a new Democratic Party. His opponents form another party, the anti-Jacksons, also known as the Whig Party. Henry Clay will be their leader. Notice in this political cartoon, known as the King Mob cartoon, we see Andrew Jackson holding the veto in his hand, but also standing on the Constitution. There will be a number of questions about Jackson's increased power of the presidency and how in many ways he tramples on the original intent of the executive powers in the Constitution. There are 3 key legacies to remember about Andrew Jackson's presidency. First, his battle with Nicholas Biddle over the National Bank. From the beginning, Jackson was opposed to the bank, and even though it had been successful and helped build America economically all the way back into the Washington administration, Jackson vowed to destroy it. Nicholas Biddle and the Whigs tried to outmaneuver Jackson by bringing the bank charter back up for renewal before Jackson's re-election campaign. Jackson defies them and vetoes the bank anyway. Unfortunately, this will throw America into an economic crisis that will be inherited by Martin Van Buren, Jackson's vice president. He'll become known as Van Ruin as a result of the recession. But the bank veto shows Jackson's intent to use the power of the presidency for more than just a figurehead role. More than any president before him, he will use the veto power to show his intent to dominate the Congress and set the agenda instead of just execute the laws. The second legacy to remember is the nullification crisis and the subsequent Hayne-Webster debate that results. When the Tariff of Abominations passes the U.S. Congress and is signed by the President, the southern states intend to defy it. Imported goods affect southern states more than any other, and the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, actually resigns in protest over this issue. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, 2 senators rise to argue the issue of nullifying laws. On the one side is Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina, who argues a very legal and logical argument that because the Constitution has been violated, the southern states no longer have to follow it. But then Daniel Webster rises, as shown in this cartoon, and argues that although the Constitution has been violated, it has always been for the common good. He closes his famous speech saying, "Union now, union forever." These 2 men are previewing for us 30 years before the Civil War the key arguments between North and South. And finally, Jackson, with the Indian Removal Act, force marching the Indians from Georgia to the Oklahoma Territory in what becomes known as the Trail of Tears, is the final of the key legacies to remember. It's most important to see, however, that Jackson, in moving the Indians west, was blatantly violating the constitutional authority of the Supreme Court, when in the Worcester v. Georgia case, John Marshall argued that the Indians owned the land and it belonged to them prior to the U.S. Constitution. Jackson, in response, argues Marshall has made his decision, but let's see him enforce it. Ultimately, the presidency of Andrew Jackson marks a major turning point, not only because of the rise of the Democratic Party and the idea of the common man in politics, but also because of the way in which Jackson transforms the presidency into an agenda-setting power instead of just a person who executes the laws. As America begins to grow and change, the federal power is growing, while at the same time, sectionalism is on the rise.